between fanatics on one side and on the other side. And there are settlers who are very violent, who carry around guns and try and get the Palestinian population to leave. But the vast majority of them aren't moving there because they say this is only for Jews. They're moving there because their government is paying them to be there. And so when we look at where our energy, I think, should be focused in terms of responsibility here, we need to look at that government itself that we would expect to be the one to uphold the law, to counter any kind of illegal, irrational kind of tendency. But instead what we find is that that government itself is the one fueling it, and that's what is extremely dangerous and disturbing. Thanks to these kinds of generous offers, there are now settlements all over the West Bank. These red dots here show you where you have one of these Jewish-only colonies built there, and you see the way that process of gradually taking over the land and resources really is multiplying. Along with the colonies comes the road network that connects them to each other. Here's just a handful, the blue roads here of those Israeli highways running through the area. There are many smaller ones as well, but just to show the way that the roads themselves even chop up and compartmentalize the landscape. Remember, and what's very interesting about these roads is that they're not for everybody. In fact, the roads in the occupied territories are segregated. So in these areas, you have both Palestinians and Israelis living there, but they use different roads. There are Palestinian roads, and then there are Israeli roads. The Palestinian roads tend to be older, sometimes even unusable like this one. The Israeli roads tend to be more modern, constructed by the Israeli government for Israeli people living there. And the Palestinians are not allowed to use the Israeli roads, unless they can get a kind of permit, in which case maybe they can use one part of one road, let's say, but in all other cases the roads are segregated. Palestinians and Israelis in the area have different colored license plates. Palestinian cars have green or white plates, Israeli cars have yellow colored plates, so that it's easy to see from far away which kind of person is using which kind of road. Here, for example, you have a road with two lanes. The lane on the left is for Israelis and the lane on the right is for Palestinians. So all green or white plated Palestinian cars have to pull over at the side of what's called a checkpoint where they're going to be screened. And checkpoints are a major part of any occupation. We would see them here if you're vying for other occupation. The idea behind them is something like what you might experience at like a border crossing. You know, if you go down to Mexico, for example, from here, on your way back, you're going to be stopped at a checkpoint. You're going to have to show your ID. You're going to have to answer questions, maybe open up your bag to be checked. This is sort of a process that we accept with nation states, that people traveling have to sort of show their IDs. But one of the big differences with checkpoints in this part of the world, as you can see from this map of the permanent checkpoints that have been installed in the West Bank, these blue things here, is that the vast majority of these checkpoints are not located between the West Bank and present-day Israel, but actually located internally within the Palestinian remaining territories. So most of these are between Palestinian towns and villages, rather than between Palestinian towns and Israeli towns. And what this means for a Palestinian person who, let's say, is living up in Jenin and wants to travel, I don't know, 30 miles south to the city of Nablus. So let's say, what is that, about the distance between here and Long Beach, maybe? A little bit. How far is Long Beach, would you say? 30, 25 miles. Okay. Maybe that's closer to, I don't know, just south of Jenin to Nablus. Okay, so let's say you're a Palestinian, you want to travel this distance. Well, to drive from here to Long Beach, it takes, I don't know, 30, 45 minutes. It's really bad traffic, that's another story. But let's talk about, not rush hour, maybe an hour tops. Well, for a Palestinian person to drive that same distance between here and Long Beach, it's going to take minimum 3.5, 4 hours, but probably more like 6 to 8 to even 10 hours, because of the number of times that person's going to have to stop along the way to show their ID at these checkpoints. So clearly this is a very frustrating. People are spending a lot of time waiting constantly at checkpoints. But it's not simply a question of waiting or of frustration, but that these checkpoints are very debilitating to daily life. So, for example, here's a Palestinian businesswoman. She can't hold down a steady job. She doesn't know if it's going to take her 10 minutes or 3 hours to commute from her village or her neighborhood to where she works. or to get back home to her family in the evening. Students, if you want to go to college, unless you happen to have a university in your little village or your neighborhood, higher education is pretty much out of the question. You can't consistently get to your classes, nor can your teachers get to the classes either. So it's not just a question of time, but actually that these checkpoints prevent Palestinians from earning a living and from getting education. They affect every part of life. I mean, imagine if, let's say, you have classes at 9 o'clock in the morning, and instead of leaving your house or your dorm or whatever at 8:30, 8:45, you had to leave at, 4:30 in the morning and stand outside shivering with your ID, waiting to show your ID at these checkpoints every half mile or so, and people of a different religion from you or different ethnicity were sort of whizzing by. How would that affect your education? How about your spiritual life, going through that process on the way to church, on the way to the mosque, etc.? What about your social life? Your family life, going to see your family and going through that? How about going to the hospital? If it's an emergency, here's a green and white plated Palestinian ambulance that's pulling over to the side of the road to allow a yellow plated Israeli vehicle privilege and priority on that road. And these ambulances will also wait for hours at a time. In fact, I documented in my book, for example, story after story after story after story, endless stories of women going into labor at checkpoints, unable to reach the hospital, their premature babies dying because they can't get to an incubator, people dying of asthma attacks because they can't get to an oxygen tank, preventable things, as well as just everyday people dying of heart attacks. They are sitting in their cars at the checkpoint because they are not able to cross to get to the hospital. These are constant parts of daily life for Palestinians. They're not anomalies. They're happening constantly. They are the result of a situation where you can't move easily. And what was so, these things were all shocking to me. I didn't know about the segregated roads. I didn't know about any of this. I figured the checkpoints must be between Israeli towns and Palestinian towns, for example. And then my next reaction, as I began to come to grips with what was happening on the ground, was, how can this be happening? In the 21st century, how on earth, what about the international community? What's going on here? And I quickly learned that Israel is in violation of more UN resolutions than any other country in the history of the United Nations. So this is more than Iraq, Iran, etc. So why isn't the UN doing anything? I thought to myself, how can this relatively small country pay for this pretty, expensive occupation? When I say that the Israeli government is paying its own citizens to go live on Palestinian land, who's really paying those people to go live on Palestinian land? That's you and me. The US government gives Israel more than $3 billion a year. It amounts to more than $10 million every day. That's coming from our pockets to uphold these policies. So it might feel like something on the other side of the world. Perhaps you get people coming to these events on campus thinking, why all this talk about Palestine? We have our own problems. Why are people so concerned about something happening way over there? We are the ones paying for it. We should also care as human beings, but this is being done in our name with our tax dollars. And I think that we have not only a right, but a responsibility to know where those tax dollars are going, and to ensure that they're not violating fundamental human rights and international law. Celebrating here in this country the official, at least, end of segregation in the civil rights movement. Of course, segregation continues in many ways, but and at the same time paying for this blatant system of discrimination. This is sheer hypocrisy. The information needs to get out. And one of the shocking things, as Dr. Pape mentioned, is that the very population, you and I, the very population who is paying for these things to happen, doesn't know about it. And that's the most dangerous thing of all. And one reason I find for that has to do with the media. So this is an anecdote. A friend of mine was flying back from Palestine to the United States, and she had a layover first of all, in Germany, where she picked up this issue of International Newsweek, because it had a very sympathetic article about the plight of the Palestinians at the top there. So she purchased it so that she could read it on the plane. And then she had another layover in Chicago on that same flight home, where she found this.